Every European population you've ever heard of traces back to waves of migration. Farmers pushing in from Anatolia, steppe warriors riding west from the grasslands beyond the Black Sea, Celtic tribes, Roman settlers, Viking raiders, and a dozen others layering on top of each other across 10,000 years of continental reshuffling. If you go looking for the genetic fingerprints of any modern European group, what you find is exactly that. A palimpsest, a blurry stack of arrivals overriding arrivals. Conquest, blurring into intermarriage, blurring into language replacement, until the original signal is almost completely buried under the noise of history. Almost, because there is one exception. A group tucked into the western edge of Europe, where the mountains meet the Atlantic, where the story didn't follow the script, where the waves hit the shore and somehow didn't erase what was already there. Their name is Basque, and the population Europe couldn't explain isn't some ancient tribe locked in amber because they were weak or forgotten. They're a mystery precisely because they survived everything. And by the end of this video, the word isolated is going to mean something completely different to you than it does right now. So let's go back, way further back than Spain. Start with the geography, because the geography is everything here. And the mistake most people make is assuming that the Pyrenees Mountains, on the border between France and Spain, are just a backdrop, a scenic detail on a European map. That is exactly wrong, because those mountains are not a backdrop. They are the entire story, and here's why. The Pyrenees form one of the most imposing natural barriers in Western Europe. Steep, heavily forested, cut through by narrow river valleys that drain west toward the Bay of Biscay. That Atlantic coast is brutal, unpredictable, battered by heavy swells and sudden storms that punish anyone who does not know exactly what they are doing. What a landscape like this produces, what it forces, is a society built on precision and self-sufficiency. Because you cannot be vague when the valley you live in is the only flat land for 20 kilometers in any direction, and the sea outside your harbor wants to kill you. So from the beginning, the people who settled in that corner of the world had to develop specific, local, deeply practical knowledge just to survive. Knowledge of the terrain, the tides, the weather patterns. And here's what nobody tells you about that kind of hard environment. It doesn't just shape people physically. It shapes the social structures, the legal codes, the language, the entire way a community organizes itself. And it creates a kind of fierce attachment to place that you don't get in the open plains, where you can always move on, where the next valley is just as good as this one. In the Pyrenean world, there is no next valley that belongs to you. So you hold on to what you have with everything you've got. And keep that in mind. Because it matters later when we talk about empires hitting walls, and legal codes surviving conquests, and a language outlasting every political force that tried to erase it. But first, the language itself, because this is where the real puzzle begins. Most people who know anything about the Basques know that their language is weird. And when linguists say weird, they mean something very precise and very unsettling. Basque, or Euskara as its speakers call it, is a language isolate, which means it has no confirmed relatives. None. Not a single living or dead language family on Earth that it demonstrably descended from or branched alongside. That is an almost impossible thing when you understand how languages work, because languages spread, mix, borrow, and split into dialects over centuries. The way rivers branch and rejoin. Every major language spoken in Europe today belongs to the Indo-European family, such as French, Spanish, Portuguese, English, German, Russian, Greek, all of them. Despite sounding wildly different, they share common grammatical roots and core vocabulary. that trace back to a common ancestor spoken somewhere on the Eurasian steppe thousands of years ago. Then, there are the other families spoken near Europe's edges, Uralic languages like Finnish and Hungarian, Semitic languages in North Africa, Caucasian languages in the mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas, and linguists have proposed connections between Basque and some of those, particularly the Caucasian languages, but none of those proposals have held up to rigorous testing. What you're left with is a language that essentially has no family, that predates not just Latin and the Romance languages, but predates the entire Indo-European expansion into Western Europe. This means it is, as far as we can tell, a direct descendant of something spoken in that corner of the continent before the farming revolution arrived from the east, before the steppe migrations, before all of it. The thumbnail phrase that keeps coming up in academic circles is exactly right. This is the language that shouldn't exist. Not because it's impossible, but because the historical forces that erased every comparable linguistic tradition everywhere else in Europe somehow failed to erase this one. And now you have to ask, why did those forces fail here? And what exactly were those forces? And this is where the first major twist lands. Because the conventional story goes something like this. Farming arrived in Europe from the Near East around 9,000 years ago, carried by populations who migrated westward. And those farmers gradually replaced or absorbed the hunter-gatherers who had been living across Europe since the Ice Age, which is broadly true. But here's the crazy part. The Basque case doesn't fit that pattern cleanly, and ancient DNA is the reason we know that. Researchers analyzing genetic material extracted from ancient human remains found in Iberian burial sites, caves, megalithic tombs, sites dating back thousands of years, found something that stopped them cold. The genetic profiles of those ancient individuals clustered remarkably close to the profiles of modern Basque, closer than to modern Spanish or French populations. And what that implies is not that the Basque descended from farmers who arrived from the Near East and then evolved in isolation, but rather that the pre-farming hunter-gatherers who were already living in that corner of Europe survived the farming transition in unusually high proportions, possibly because the rugged Pyrenean terrain was less attractive to incoming farmers who preferred flatter, more easily cultivated lowlands. Possibly because the existing population was numerous enough or organized enough to hold their ground. Possibly both. And the farming influence did arrive and did leave a mark. But it didn't replace the earlier population the way it did in most of the rest of Europe. It partially merged with it. And the result was a population that retained a disproportionately large genetic contribution from Stone Age Western European hunter-gatherers. Which is why, when you look at their DNA today, it reads like a window into a world that everywhere else on the continent has been diluted almost beyond recognition. And that opens a much larger question, because if geography and early population density preserved the Basque gene pool through the farming transition, what happened when the really big historical forces showed up? And by really big, I mean Rome. Here's what the textbooks say about Rome and Iberia. Rome conquered the Iberian Peninsula, Romanized its populations, imposed Latin, built roads and cities and administrative systems. And in a few centuries, the linguistic and cultural landscape of Iberia was transformed so completely that the native languages, Iberian, Celtiberian, Lusitanian, others, essentially vanished, replaced by what would eventually become Spanish and Portuguese. And that is a pattern Roman repeated across most of Western Europe. And it is a genuinely impressive demonstration of how cultural and military dominance can erase ancient identities in historical time, except in the Pyrenees, where something different happened. Rome did push into the Basque region, did establish a presence, did extract resources and trade, but the full machinery of Romanization, the Latin language replacing the native tongue, the legal systems dissolving local codes, the identity markers being absorbed into Roman citizen, that machinery stalled, And this is where it gets uncomfortable if you are used to thinking of Roman power as essentially total in Western Europe. Because the Basques did not simply resist out of pure stubbornness, they negotiated. They leveraged the terrain that made conquering them expensive. They maintained local governance systems that Rome found it more practical to accommodate than to crush. And those local legal and civic codes, known later as the fueros, derived from the Basque term foruak, survived not just the Romans, but the Visigoths who came after, and then the Moorish expansion across Iberia in the 8th century, and then the medieval kingdoms of Castile and Navarre that formed around and eventually absorbed the Basque territories politically. And through all of it, the language persisted. The communal legal traditions persisted, the identity persisted, and the thumbnail for this section is blunt and accurate. The empire that could not finish the job. And that phrase applies not just to Roman, but to every subsequent power that tried to fully absorb the Basques, right up to the 20th century. But we will get there. Because first, there is a chapter in this story that almost nobody includes when they are talking about Basque history. And it involves Wales and Canada, and a discovery that genuinely rewrites the standard story of European exploration. The conventional picture of the Basques, especially in the medieval and early modern period, is of a mountain people, pastoral and insular, defined by their isolation. And that picture is deeply incomplete, because by the medieval period, Basque seafarers, whalers and fishermen operating out of ports on the Bay of Biscay had developed maritime expertise that was arguably unmatched in Western Europe, and they were ranging far, far beyond what the history books typically credit them with. Research into historical records, ship logs, tax documents, trade records, and linguistic evidence has established that Basque whalers were operating in the waters off Labrador and Newfoundland in the early 16th century, which means they were regularly crossing the North Atlantic Sea before the famous discovery voyages entered popular history. And now, watch what happens when you look at the linguistic evidence. Scholars have documented a Basque-based Creole Pidgin language that appears to have developed between Basque traders and Mi'kmaq indigenous communities in what is now Atlantic Canada, a contact language that blended Basque vocabulary and grammar with Mi'kmaq elements, which is exactly the kind of thing that happens when two groups trade regularly enough and long enough that they develop a shared communication system. That single detail, a Basque Mi'kmaq pidgin in medieval Canada, is one of the most quietly astonishing facts in the history of European exploration, because it implies sustained, repeated, organized contact between Basque seafarers and indigenous North Americans that preceded the voyages that get all the credit. Here's the paradox that makes this section worth sitting with. The same people defined by their mountain isolation, the same people who stayed genetically and linguistically distinct from everyone around them in Europe, were simultaneously ranging across the most dangerous ocean on the planet and establishing trading relationships on the other side of the world. That is not a contradiction. It is the second truth you have to hold at the same time as the first, because genetic and linguistic isolation does not mean economic or physical isolation. It means something more specific and more interesting. The Basques went out into the world on their own terms, brought back what they needed: wealth, fish oil, whale products that were in enormous demand across Europe, and came home to their valleys without dissolving into the populations they traded with. This is a kind of cultural, gravitational field that is rare and worth understanding on its own terms. And that duality goes even deeper when you bring in what happened to the Basque language and identity in the 20th century. Under Francisco Franco's dictatorship in Spain, the regional identities and languages of Spain's non-Castilian populations were actively suppressed, including Catalan, Galician, and especially Basque, because the Basques had largely opposed Franco during the Civil War and paid for it in the years that followed. Public use of Euskara was banned, cultural expression was curtailed, and a general policy of forced assimilation into a unified Spanish national identity was imposed. The Basque language, already spoken by a relatively small population, faced severe repression. In a geographically limited area, already carrying the weight of being an isolate with no closely related languages to draw loanwords or learners from, the Basque language came genuinely near functional extinction. The number of fluent speakers declined sharply across the middle decades of the 20th century as urbanization, migration, and political repression pushed younger generations toward Spanish. Then, something happened that almost never occurs in the history of minority languages. It came back. After Franco's death and Spain's transition to democracy, the Basque autonomous community established Euskara as a co-official language, invested heavily in immersion education programs, and standardized a common written form of the language from its several dialects. Over the following decades, speaker numbers grew, not back to what they were before industrialization and suppression, but meaningfully. A language that was genuinely on the edge began pulling back. That is the second duality you have to hold. A people whose genetic signature survived 10,000 years of continental migration waves, whose language survived the Roman Empire, the Moorish expansion, and the medieval kingdoms, nearly lost both in a single century of modern state power and then did not. The story does not resolve into a clean moral lesson. It simply sits there as two true things at once, the fragility and the resilience. That tension is much more honest than a triumphalist, they survived everything narrative, or a tragic, the modern world destroys ancient identities narrative, because both halves are true and neither cancels the other. Now here's where the DNA becomes the detective proof. Because all of this, the geographic argument, the linguistic argument, the historical argument, converges on the genetics. And what the genetics show is striking. Studies analyzing ancient DNA recovered from archaeological sites across Iberia and comparing it to modern population data have found that Basques cluster genetically closer to early Neolithic Western Europeans, the populations that inhabited Western Europe in the millennia following the farming transition, than their Spanish and French neighbors do. And what that means in plain language is this. While the rest of the Iberian Peninsula and most of France absorbed significant genetic input from later migrations, particularly the Bronze Age steppe populations who swept across Europe from the east and contributed substantially to the ancestry of most modern Europeans, the Basque population absorbed comparatively less of that steppe signal, which left them with a genetic profile that looks, in some meaningful ways, more like a snapshot of an earlier phase of European prehistory than anything else currently living. And the DNA doesn't match the map in the sense that if you knew nothing about the Basques except their geographic location, nestled between France and Spain, surrounded by populations that have been interacting and trading and fighting and intermarrying for millennia, you would not predict the degree of genetic distinctiveness the data shows. It's the kind of result that makes geneticists double-check their methods. And then when they do, the pattern holds. But there's a layer inside this that's even more interesting, which is what happens when you look at the male and female lineages separately, because they tell slightly different stories. The Y chromosome data, which tracks the male line, passed from father to son, shows strong continuity within the Basque population across time, meaning Basque men have been reproducing primarily within the community across many generations, which could reflect either cultural preference for endogamy, geographic barriers limiting outside male gene flow, or both. Either way, the signal is of a male population that stayed remarkably local over a long period. The mitochondrial data, which tracks the female line, passed from mother to child, shows a somewhat more mixed picture, with slightly more evidence of outside genetic influence. This pattern appears in many populations worldwide, and is generally interpreted as reflecting different mobility patterns between men and women. Women moving between communities through marriage more often than men, or outside men integrating less frequently than outside women, or some combination of factors that researchers are still working to fully untangle. And then there's the blood type question, because for decades before modern genetics existed, scientists noticed that the Basque population had unusually high frequencies of certain blood type variants compared to surrounding populations, particularly high rates of the Rh negative blood type. This was seized on by various fringe theories over the years to argue for everything from alien ancestry to lost civilizations, all of which is nonsense. But the underlying observation is real, and modern genetics now interprets it correctly. Those unusual frequencies are not evidence of a separate species or supernatural origin. They are a signature of deep ancestry, a reflection of the fact that this population has been relatively genetically isolated long enough that variants that exist at low levels in most European populations have drifted to higher frequency here through the mathematics of small, closed breeding populations over long timescales. This is a completely mundane genetic process that happens whenever a population remains isolated, and understanding it as an ancestral signature rather than a racial category is exactly the kind of reframing that modern genetics provides when explained carefully. Finally, the neighbor comparison might be the most clarifying single data point in the whole story. When you run the genetic distance calculations between Basques and their immediate neighbors, the Spanish and the French, and compare that to the genetic distance between the Spanish and the French themselves, the Basques are more genetically distant from both neighbors than those neighbors are from each other. This is a remarkable statement about how genuinely distinct this population's ancestry is, given that Spain and France are not exactly close genetic twins themselves. Taken together, these patterns form a coherent detective picture, a population that was in place before the major migration waves, that absorbed less of the farming and steppe gene flow than surrounding groups, that shows the kind of genetic drift signatures you get from prolonged relative isolation, and that preserves, in their living genome, a closer echo of Stone Age Western Europe than anything else on the continent. That is not a mystery anymore. It is a solved case with a clear answer that just happens to be stranger and more interesting than the puzzle it replaced. So let's come back to where we started, because this is where the original picture has to shrink to its real size. The Basques. Isolated, weird, unexplained. That's the shorthand, the lazy summary, the version that fits in a caption. And it's not wrong exactly. It's just so small compared to what's actually there that using it feels like describing the ocean by saying it's wet. What the evidence actually shows is this: a population that stood in place while the continent reorganized itself around them, not because they were passive or cut off or primitive, but because the terrain they occupied gave them options that most populations didn't have. The option to negotiate instead of capitulate, to trade without dissolving, to preserve a language that carries the echo of a world 10,000 years gone, to look Rome in the eye and make a deal instead of a surrender, to cross the North Atlantic in wooden ships and build a working vocabulary with people on the other side while never losing track of the valleys they came home to. And the genetics is the final confirmation that this is not romantic myth-making, that the distinctiveness is real, that when you look at their DNA, you are genuinely looking at something that the rest of Europe mostly doesn't have anymore. A thread running back to before the farming revolution, before the steppe migrations, before the Indo-European languages covered the continent like a tide. A remnant, not of weakness, but of a specific, hard-won, geographically enabled stubbornness that turned out to be one of the most durable human strategies in the archaeological record. And that brings us to the real takeaway, because the Basques are not the point, or rather, they're the point of entry, not the destination. The populations we call mysteries are almost always just the ones that survived long enough to remember what everyone else forgot. The ones where the waves hit differently, where the mountains, or the deserts, or the marshes, or the islands gave the people inside them just enough protection to hold on to something that the open plains erased. And every time science goes looking for the pure origin, the original population, the one group that represents what everyone was before the mixing began, what it finds instead is complexity all the way down. Earlier mixing on top of earlier mixing. Migrations before the migrations we knew about. And in the middle of all that noise, occasionally a signal like this one, a language with no relatives, a genome with deep roots, a people who built ships and crossed oceans and still came home to their own valleys speaking their own words. And that is not an exception to the human story. That is the human story made visible in one place because the conditions were right for it to survive. So here's the question I want you to think about and drop in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious. Do you think language or DNA matters more to identity? If you had to keep one and lose the other, which one would you choose? And if this story grabbed you, the next one is going to hit differently, because next time we're looking at another population. Europe couldn't place, sitting at the crossroads of 3 continents, carrying an ancestry that rewrites everything you thought you knew about the ancient world's borderlines. And that origin story is anything but clean.